Welcome back. A warning on the consumer. While markets were closed for Good Friday, March retail sales came out and they were down for a second month in a row. Are we seeing a discount all the way to luxury? A story in the Wall Street Journal highlighting how Neiman Marcus's wealthy customers are looking for discounts. Joining us right now to talk all about that, Macromavens President Stephanie Pomboy. Stephanie, good to see you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
For joining us. A lot to talk about, and you've been talking about a weak consumer story for a long time. What did the retail sales numbers tell you on Friday?
Well, we finally are seeing the weakness that I've seen under the surface reflected in the headline numbers. I think part of it we talked about last time is that we had this huge energy price illusion in terms of you had the huge rebound in energy prices over the last year, and that was inflating the headline spending stats. Retail sales aren't adjusted for inflation, so you had this huge increase in the gasoline component of it, and that's starting to fade away, which is now showing underneath the surface that consumers really weren't spending a lot on discretionary goods.
What's holding consumers back? I mean, sentiment is at 10-year highs right now. Jobs are growing, wages are picking up. What's the problem that you see?
Well, actually, total personal income tax returns are in negative territory year on year, which is amazing. When you look at the headline job growth, you'd think, okay, well, the consumer must be doing better, but it's not following through to income. So the wage gains have actually been pretty restrained. And I think part of it gets back to the whole healthcare story, and that is that if a company's got to pay more out in benefits, they're going to hold back on wages. So your total compensation numbers look good, but the share of that you're getting in terms of money you can actually spend is diminishing, and that's restraining spending. And we've seen that, you know, for months here.
We talk a lot about policies and the perception or the expectation whether or not health care will be reformed or tax reform will happen. How much of that truly weighs on the individual consumer or is reflected in those confidence numbers or their likelihood to step out?
Well, I think right now, clearly, there's a huge divergence between the confidence and what people are actually able to do. You know, hope is not something you can spend at Neiman Marcus. So, you know, they're hopeful that things are going to change. But at the end of the day, they come home and they've got a certain amount of money to work with. And as we saw in the Journal today, they're borrowing more. And that borrowing, again, is not driving discretionary purchases. Increasingly, they're having to borrow just to fund every, you know, day expenses.
But what's it going to take to get the consumer moving again? I mean, what do you think? Is it policy? Is it just a demand story?
I think they're going to need to see more income, and that can happen from reduced non-discretionary obligations such as health care to increased wages, which again I think would be greatly, the odds of that would be increased by having companies have less of a burden from paying these the health care expenses, so that they could divvy up a bigger portion to wages rather than to benefits.
So consumers account for 2/3 of all economic output. With weak consumers, are you calling for a recession here? Are you calling for a slowdown?
Well, I think the consumer is really sluggish. If things get worse, then we would see a recession. I'm very hopeful that we'll get this health repeal done and then pave the way for tax reform. I'm very hopeful that that will happen, in which case we could probably, you know, eschew a recession. But if we continue on this current path,
without Washington acting, we will be in recession.
I believe so, yes.
Then by the end of the year?
Well, I mean, we're clearly headed that way. If you look at, again, if you look at the amount of distressed borrowing, you know, you've never seen credit card borrowing accelerate and discretionary spending not also accelerate without a recession. Anytime they've accelerated credit card borrowing without follow-through to discretionary spending, it's been a sign that we're on the eve of recession.
Talk about autos for a second. They had a great run, and now they're flattening out. Inventories are rising. How troubling a sign is that?
Well, clearly, I mean, we've seen the warning signs on that for a while, in part because it wasn't sales. You know, people were borrowing. It was all about credit. And as soon as rates started to move up and the credit terms got a little bit more restrictive, you know, the sales ended. And the production continued apace, so you could see that this problem was brewing. And now we're working down this massive inventory. The other problem is that because they extended lease terms so much, they kind of cannibalized future sales in an effort to just drive marginal incremental sales.
Are you not impressed with the earnings picture right now, the first quarter earnings?
Well, I think if you take away energy, you're looking at half the gain. What is it, 9% overall? You take energy out, it's 5%. So it gets back to my story about the role that energy played in creating this illusion of strength.
Wow.
Just because of the massive increase over the last year.
That's going to fade now.
Wow. What it was really.
Stick around. I'm just getting warmed up.
Watching this, because it's not always that direct that these policies have that impact. But in this case, it's exactly right.
Really great insight, Stephanie, as always. Thank you so much.
We'll
be watching. And you think that we'll know in terms of the consumer and how they're doing in the next 6 months?
Sounds like in the next month. Sounds like we got to find some solution to healthcare in the next month, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Fingers crossed, right?
All right, we'll be watching. Stephanie Pomboy is president at Macromavens.